Smile when your uncle talks to you, my mother whispered as guests filled our dining room. And please don't embarrass us tonight. I forced a weak smile and adjusted my cheap shirt while my older brother Ethan walked downstairs wearing a perfect black suit. There he is. Uncle Robert shouted. The future millionaire. Everyone clapped for Ethan like he had just won an award. Ethan grinned. You guys are too kind. My father laughed proudly. My son closed another business deal this week. At his age, I had nothing. I stayed near the wall, holding a tray of empty glasses. Nobody noticed me except Grandma Eleanor, who sat quietly beside the window. Aren't both your sons working hard? Aunt Lisa asked. My mother sighed loudly before answering. Ethan works hard. Daniel just survives. A few relatives laughed under their breath. I looked down at the floor. I had heard those words my entire life. Ethan received praise. I received pity. My cousin Jake slapped Ethan on the shoulder. I saw your new car outside. That thing looks expensive. It was a gift to myself, Ethan said proudly. You should come for a ride sometime. Jake nodded excitedly. Of course. Nobody asked how I arrived. My old motorcycle was parked 2 streets away because I did not want the family mocking it again. My father pointed toward Ethan. That boy understands success. Daniel wastes too much time chasing impossible dreams. I finally spoke. I work 2 jobs, Dad. And still barely pay rent, my mother replied quickly. The room became silent for a moment. I felt heat rising inside my chest, but I swallowed my anger. Grandma Eleanor looked at me carefully. Daniel has always been kind. My mother waved her hand dismissively. Kindness does not build a future. Ethan walked toward me with a fake smile. Relax, Mom. Maybe Daniel just needs more guidance. I clenched my jaw. I don't need guidance. Ethan leaned closer and lowered his voice. Then why are you still failing? His words hit harder than I expected. For a second I wanted to punch him. Instead I stepped back. The dinner continued while Ethan entertained everyone with stories about investors, luxury hotels, and expensive parties. I listened quietly while carrying plates to the kitchen. Daniel, my father called from the table, why don't you learn something from your brother? I forced another smile. Maybe because we are different people. My father shook his head. That sounds like an excuse. The guests nodded in agreement. I felt invisible. No matter what I achieved, Ethan always stood higher. Sometimes I wondered if my parents even remembered my birthday without Ethan reminding them. Every achievement of mine disappeared inside his shadow. I could have vanished from that house forever and the guests might not have noticed until dinner ended there. When I graduated from college, my parents skipped the ceremony because Ethan had a business meeting that same day. When I got my first apartment, my mother complained that the neighborhood looked poor. When Ethan bought a watch worth more than my yearly salary, my father proudly showed pictures to every relative he knew. I carried another plate into the kitchen and stared at my reflection in the dark window. Maybe they're right, I whispered to myself. Behind me, Grandma Eleanor entered quietly. You should not say that, she told me. I sighed tiredly. You heard them tonight. I heard foolish people, she replied. I looked at her carefully. Grandma Eleanor was the only person in the family who never treated me like a disappointment. She reached into her pocket and pulled out an old silver watch. The glass was slightly scratched and the leather strap looked worn. This belonged to your grandfather, she said softly. I stared at the watch in surprise. Why are you giving this to me? Because he was ignored too, she answered. People laughed at him before he built his company. I blinked in shock. Grandpa. She nodded slowly. Success changes how people remember you. Voices and laughter exploded from the dining room again. Ethan was probably telling another story. Grandma Eleanor placed the watch into my hand and closed my fingers around it. One day, she whispered, they will regret how they treated you. I looked down at the watch, feeling its weight resting against my palm. For the first time that night, I felt something stronger than shame. Oh. I returned to the dining room quietly. Ethan stood at the center of the table while everyone applauded him again. My father raised a glass proudly. To Ethan, the pride of this family. The room echoed with cheers. I remained silent near the doorway, holding Grandpa's old watch tightly in my pocket while Grandma's words repeated again and again inside my mind. I need to talk to you right now, I said, standing in front of Lily near the campus gate, my hands shaking slightly. Lily looked at me carefully. Daniel? You're scaring me. What's wrong? I swallowed hard. It's not wrong. I just need to be honest with you no matter what happens. She folded her arms. Okay, but you're making me nervous. I took a breath. I've liked you for years, Lily. I try to ignore it every single day, but I can't anymore. I needed you to know. She blinked slowly. Daniel, I honestly didn't expect this from you. I stepped closer. Just tell me if I should stop hoping. She looked down, then gave a small nervous smile. You're not wasting your time, but I need to be honest too. I frowned. What is it? Just say it. She hesitated. I'm already seeing someone, and it's serious. My voice dropped. Who is it? She bit her lip. Ethan. I felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. My brother Ethan? She nodded quickly. It just happened recently. I didn't know how to tell you without hurting you. I laughed once, but it broke halfway. So while I was here, it was him? She whispered, please don't be upset at me. I pulled back. I'm not upset at you. I think I'm just invisible again. She reached slightly. Daniel, I really am sorry. I nodded slowly. Yeah. I guess that's life for me. I turned away before she could see my eyes. Later that night, I stopped outside a cafe when I heard Ethan's voice from inside. I moved closer and saw him sitting with friends, relaxed like he owned the world. One of them asked, so Lily really chose you over everything? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Of course she did. That wasn't even hard. Another friend laughed. What about your brother? Ethan smirked. Daniel? He never had a chance. He always plays the losing role. They all laughed loudly. Ethan continued, honestly, she was the only thing he cared about. I just redirected her attention. My fists tightened in my pockets. One friend asked, you don't feel bad? Ethan shrugged. Why would I? He survives disappointment daily. Another friend laughed. That's cold. Ethan smiled. It's reality. I stepped back into the darkness. So I really was just a joke to him? At home, my mother saw me and frowned immediately. Why do you look like that again? I said, it doesn't matter. She crossed her arms. Let me guess. Lily? She's with Ethan, I said flatly. She sighed. Then stop overthinking it. Your brother earned it. I stared at her. Earned what? My life falling apart? She snapped, don't be dramatic. Learn from him instead of competing. I shook my head. I'm not competing. I'm just tired of losing to him in everything. That night, the dining room was full again. Ethan entered confidently with Lily beside him. My chest tightened instantly. My father smiled proudly. Lily, welcome to the family. Lily smiled politely. Thank you, sir. Ethan raised his hand. Actually, I want to say something important. The room went silent. I whispered, don't do this now. Ethan pulled out a ring slowly and went down on one knee. Lily, will you marry me? The room exploded instantly. My mother screamed, yes. Yes. My father laughed loudly. That's my boy right there. Lily covered her mouth. Yes, I will. Applause filled the entire room. I stepped back. I really don't belong here. My mother called out, Daniel, stop being selfish. But I was already turning away. Outside, rain started falling hard. I kept walking until the celebration faded behind me. I stopped in the empty street. They really took everything, I whispered. I gave a broken laugh. And I still stayed quiet like I always do. I dropped to my knees in the rain. For the first time, I let myself feel everything without hiding it anymore. I stayed there until the rain blurred everything and I no longer recognized my own voice completely. I slammed the door and shouted, enough. I can't take this anymore. Father said, you think yelling changes anything? You will never become anything important, Daniel. I felt my chest burn. Ethan laughed. Here we go again. The failed brother giving speeches. I snapped, shut up, Ethan. You always think you're better than me. Mother said, Daniel, stop embarrassing us. Look at your brother. I said, I'm done listening to all of you. Father replied, then leave if you're so useless. Ethan added, he won't survive a week outside. I grabbed my bag. Mother warned, don't come back when you fail. I opened the door. Father said, you're nothing without this family. I stepped out. I walked through the dark street feeling empty. I whispered, so this is it? I really have nothing left. I sat on a broken bench. He asked, hey kid, you okay? I replied, does it look like I'm okay? He said, rough night? I answered, rough life. He smiled, name's Daniel Brooks. I said, funny, same first name. He chuckled, life's strange like that. He offered, take this sandwich. I said, I don't need charity. He replied, not charity. Just food. I hesitated then took it. He asked, you ran away from home? I said, yeah, they never wanted me anyway. He said, my father threw me out too. I asked, what did you do? He said, kept working. Kept surviving. I looked at him and felt something shift inside me. He said, you still got time to stand up. I said, no one at home cares if I stand or fall. He replied, then stop going back to people who don't value you. I breathed in rain night. I said, I won't beg them anymore. He said, good. That's the first step. I stared at the empty road and made a decision. I said, from today, I choose myself. He said, then you're already stronger than you think. Rain kept falling but I didn't move. He asked, where will you go now? I said, anywhere the past can't follow. He said, work with me tomorrow at the site. I asked, why would you help me? He said, because someone once helped me. I nodded, all right, I'll try. He smiled, that's all I ask. I felt first small hope in a long time. He said, rest here a bit. I said, you don't even know me. He replied, I know enough. I sat watching empty road lights flicker. I thought, I used to think family was everything. But maybe I was wrong. He returned, eat more. You need strength. I said, I don't have money. He said, you already paid with honesty. I said, no one at home ever said that. He replied, then they're blind. I stood. I said, I'm not going back. He said, good. I walked away from the station into the cold rain streets. I said, this is my new beginning. I thought about everything I lost tonight. But I also lost fear. I said, no more waiting for their approval. He called, you got this, Daniel? I kept walking until the city lights swallowed me. I said, morning already? He asked, did you sleep? I said, barely. He said, good. Work starts early. Worker asked, who's the new guy? He said, he's with me. Worker said, does he know anything? He said, he'll learn. I said, I can work. Worker said, we'll see. I thought, I've never been given a chance like this. He said, just follow instructions. I said, I will. For the first time I wasn't called useless. He said, eat lunch with us later. I said, okay. Worker asked, you running from something? I said, from people who never saw me. Worker said, that sounds heavy. I said, it is. He said, here, drink water. I said, thanks. I looked at the sky and felt different. I said, maybe this is where I start rebuilding. He said, you talk like someone who lost a lot. I said, I lost everything that mattered to me. He said, then you have nothing left to fear. I said, maybe that's freedom. Something inside me finally felt quiet. I said, I'm not going back, not ever. He said, good man. I said, do you ever miss your old life? He said, every day. But I don't go back. I said, then maybe I can do the same. He said, you already are. I realized pain doesn't end but you can move through it. I said, I won't beg my family again. He said, that's the spirit. I walked away from him toward unknown road. I said, I choose myself now. The rain stopped but my life had already changed. He said, Daniel? I said, yeah? He said, don't lose this version of you. I said, I won't. I walked forward without looking back. I said, for the first time I wasn't chasing approval. I said, I was building something new. I said, everything they said about me, it doesn't matter anymore. I felt wind against my face as I kept walking into uncertainty. I said, if I fall again I will stand alone. He said, that's how you survive. I said, I used to think love meant being chosen. I said, now I know it means choosing yourself. I disappeared into the road ahead, leaving everything behind. I said, I am done waiting for a family that never saw me. He said, go on, Daniel. I said, I am already gone. I walked until even their voices stopped existing in my mind. I said, this is the night I stopped belonging to them. I said, and started belonging to myself. Forever I moved forward. I woke up before sunrise in the tiny apartment I shared with Daniel Brooks. Daniel Brooks was already tying his boots. He said, you're late again. I said, I worked a night shift. He replied, bills don't pay themselves. I said, I know. That's why I'm still standing. He said, eat something before you collapse. I said, no time. I have another job interview. He laughed. You call that a job? It's a gamble. I smiled. Everything in my life feels like a gamble anyway. I walked into the small conference room for my pitch. The investors barely looked at me. I said, I believe this idea can work. We hear that every day. No funding. I felt my chest drop. I heard the last part from the doorway. Sophia Bennett said, you should not pitch like that. I said, excuse me? She said, you're selling survival, not emotion. I said, and you are? She said, someone who fixes broken ideas. I said, this one is already broken. She said, then rebuild it. I said, why help me? She said, because I see you're still fighting. I said, we have no money. Daniel Brooks said, we have effort. Sophia said, we need direction. I said, we need everything. I said, I haven't slept in 2 days. Sophia said, sleep is optional. Success isn't. Daniel Brooks said, coffee first, breakdown later. I said, everything is failing. Sophia said, good. That means we're close. I said, another rejection email. Daniel Brooks said, collect them. They become fuel. Sophia said, pain can destroy you or build you. I said, I'm tired of being destroyed. Sophia said, then choose build. I sat in front of the investor board. I said, because I have nothing left to lose. Sophia said, and everything to gain. Daniel Brooks said, he doesn't quit. We'll invest. I exhaled relief. Sophia said, told you. I said, this is just the beginning. Daniel Brooks said, and you survived the worst already. Sophia said, now build the rest. I looked outside window. I said, I am no longer who they broke. I am who I rebuilt. Sophia said, we still need product stability. I said, it crashes every hour. Daniel Brooks said, then we fix it every hour. I laughed, that sounds like torture. Sophia said, startup life is exactly that. I said, I feel like collapsing. Sophia said, then sit. Not quit. Daniel Brooks said, I've seen worse than this. I said, why are you both still here? Sophia said, because we believe in results. Daniel Brooks said, because giving up is easier. I said, nothing about my life is easy. Investor said, this model is unstable. I said, we can scale it. We don't believe you yet. Sophia whispered, not yet is still progress. I said, we are running out of time. Daniel Brooks said, then we run faster. I said, sometimes I miss my old life. Sophia said, which part? The abuse or ignorance? I said, the illusion of family. Daniel Brooks said, you outgrew it. I said, my hands are shaking. Sophia said, keep typing. I said, what if we fail completely? Sophia said, then we fail forward. Daniel Brooks said, failure means we tried. I said, I'm not used to trying without fear. Sophia said, fear is normal. Staying is choice. We reviewed your progress. I said, and? We're investing. I froze. Sophia said, we did it. Daniel Brooks said, told you we would. I said, is this real? Signed agreement coming. Sophia said, this is only round 1. I said, then I'm ready for round 2. Daniel Brooks said, you changed fast. I said, I had no choice. Sophia said, you chose correctly. I said, I used to think success was for others. Daniel Brooks said, now it's yours too. Sophia said, you built it from nothing. I said, what do we do next? Sophia said, we scale carefully. Daniel Brooks said, and hire help. I said, I never thought I'd be here. Sophia said, life doesn't ask permission. I said, I feel different. Daniel Brooks said, you are different. Sophia said, you survived transformation. I said, I won't go back to who I was. Sophia said, good. That version survived already. I said, what if everything collapses tomorrow? Daniel Brooks said, then we rebuild again. Sophia said, and again. I laughed, you two are insane. I said, but maybe that's what I needed. Sophia said, not maybe. Definitely. Daniel Brooks said, welcome to survival. I said, I used to think pain ended people. Sophia said, it starts people too. I said, then I guess I started. Daniel Brooks said, you've been starting for weeks. Sophia said, and now it shows. I said, I won't stop now. Don't. Never again. I said, everything I lost led me here. Exactly. Now build more. I will build until there is nothing left to break. That's enough. We start again tomorrow. And I will not look back again. I said I thought success would change how they see me. Daniel said it did, just not in the way you expected. I said now they look at me like they need me. Sophia said that is the part nobody prepares you for. I said I don't feel happy about it. Daniel said because validation from them was never the answer. I said so what is? Sophia said building something that outlives their opinion. I said that sounds heavier than failure. Daniel said it is, but it is yours. I said I used to think coming back would fix something. Sophia said nothing there needed fixing. Daniel said only acceptance. I said I don't feel like I belong there anymore. Sophia said you don't belong where you shrink. Daniel said you outgrew the place. I said I felt their eyes change when I walked in. Sophia said because power shifted. I said that scared me. Daniel said good, it means you are aware. I said I didn't expect respect from them. Sophia said respect follows results, not history. I said I saw Ethan differently today. Daniel said how? I said not as a rival but as someone stuck. Sophia said and that changes everything. I said my mother looked at me like she needed me. Daniel said that is reversal. I said I didn't know how to feel. Sophia said you don't need to feel anything for them. I said I think I finally understand. Daniel said what? I said I was never meant to stay broken for them. Sophia said exactly. Daniel said and now? I said now I keep building. Sophia said and never look back. I said not anymore. Daniel said good. I said news spread fast. Victor Hayes betrayed Ethan and his empire collapsed overnight. Daniel Brooks said this is what unchecked deals look like. I said so everything he built is gone. Sophia said reputation falls faster than money. I watched silently as headlines destroyed Ethan's name. Lily said I can't stay with him like this. I said you never cared about him, just his money. She said that's not fair anymore. Daniel. One evening Ethan came to my office looking broken. Ethan said I need help, we are brothers. I felt anger rise inside me immediately. I said brothers don't destroy each other's lives. He said I made mistakes, I lost everything. Sophia said don't let old wounds decide your future. I said he never called me family before today. Daniel Brooks said forgiveness is not weakness, it's control. My mother called me saying Ethan needs you now. I said he never needed me when I was nothing. She said family doesn't work like that anymore. I sat alone thinking about revenge and compassion fighting inside me. Sophia said if you act from pain you lose yourself again. I said I don't know who deserves my help anymore. Daniel Brooks said then don't decide today. I said everything I built was to escape them. Sophia said now you must build beyond them, not because of them. I said I feel nothing and everything at the same time. My father finally called saying save your brother. I said he never saved me when I was drowning. Silence filled the room after I spoke. Sophia said this decision defines your next chapter, not theirs. I said I won't let them control me anymore. Daniel Brooks said then act like it. Ethan said quietly we are still brothers. I said no, we became strangers the moment you chose yourself over me. He looked down and said I didn't mean it like that. I turned away, not ready to forgive yet. Sophia said walk away if it protects your future. I said maybe I don't need to choose between revenge and peace. Daniel Brooks said choose growth, it includes both. I said then I choose growth. Sophia said that is the only way forward. I said I will not let them break me again. Daniel Brooks said they already failed at that. My mother kept calling but I didn't answer. Sophia said silence is also a decision. I said for the first time I feel free from them. Daniel Brooks said freedom always feels like loss at first. I said then I accept the loss. Sophia said good, now we move forward. Ethan said softly please don't abandon me. I said you abandoned me long before this moment. Silence fell heavier between us. Sophia said this is where you decide who you become. I said I already know who I am becoming. Daniel Brooks said say it out loud. I said I am becoming someone who no longer needs their approval. Sophia said that is real power. I said and I will protect it. Daniel Brooks said then you are ready for anything. I said even them. Sophia said especially them. I said I will face whatever comes. Daniel Brooks said that's the mindset that wins. I said then I am already ahead of them. Sophia said no, you surpassed them a long time ago. I said I just didn't realize it. Daniel Brooks said now you do. I said yes I do. Sophia said then let's continue building. I said together. Daniel Brooks said always together. I said I will not stop no matter what they do. Sophia said that's why you will succeed. I said even if Ethan falls completely. Daniel Brooks said especially if he falls. I said I don't want revenge anymore. Sophia said that means you are free. I said I just want peace. Daniel Brooks said then you already won. I said I finally believe that. Sophia said welcome to your new life. I said I am not who I used to be. Daniel Brooks said no, you are better. I said I will prove it with action. Sophia said then go build your future. I said I will. Daniel Brooks said good because we start again. I said and this time I never fall back. Sophia said that's the promise that matters. I said I promise. Daniel Brooks said then it's done. I said, not done, just beginning. Sophia said, exactly. I said, and I will keep going. Daniel Brooks said, no matter who returns. I said, no matter what happens. Sophia said, then you are unbreakable. I said, I am finally free. I said, I am no longer defined by them and I will keep building my life forward without looking back again ever again. I said. Claire arrived at my office holding a small wooden box. Claire said, you need to see this. I said, what is it? She said, it belonged to Grandma Eleanor. I said, why are you giving it to me now? She said, because she wanted you to have it eventually. I opened the box slowly. I said, these are letters. Claire said, read them carefully. I said, the first letter was shaking in my hands. Grandma said, in letter, I tried to stop your parents from hurting you. I said, my breath stopped. Claire said, keep reading. I said, she wrote again, I begged them every year to treat you fairly. Letter said, they never listened. I said, my chest tightened. Claire said, there is more. I said, I opened another letter. Letter said, your father lost money because of Ethan's mistakes. I said, what? Claire said, read it fully. Letter said he blamed Daniel to protect family reputation. I said, that is not possible. Claire said, it is written there. I said, my voice broke. I said, all this time it was lies. Claire said, not all lies but hidden truth. I said, I feel like I cannot breathe. Letter said, Grandma knew everything. I said, she tried to protect me. Claire said, yes, she did. I said, I stood up suddenly. Claire said, where are you going? I said, I need to see her. Claire said, she is gone, Daniel. I said, I know, but I need to go. I said, I reached her grave in the evening. Wind said nothing but silence around me. I said, I do not even know what to say. I said, you knew the truth all along. I said, why did nobody tell me? I said, tears came without control. I said, I hated them for years. I said, but they were also trapped in lies. I said, I do not know what I feel anymore. I said, revenge feels empty now. I said, Grandma, I miss you. I said, I wish I knew sooner. I said, everything I believed was broken. I said, I do not want this anger anymore. I said, I just feel tired. I said, maybe they were wrong but also broken. I said, maybe I do not need to carry this hate. I said, but letting go feels like losing myself. I said, I do not know who I am without it. I said, I sat by the grave longer. I said, for the first time I cried openly. I said, no one was there to judge me. I said, only silence answered. I said, maybe forgiveness is not forgetting. I said, maybe it is choosing to move forward. I said, but I am not ready yet. I said, I just want peace. I said, I stood up slowly. I said, I will think about everything again. I said, but not with hate this time. I said, maybe I can choose something else. I said, I left the grave with heavy steps. I said, but lighter than before. I said, because truth hurts less than lies. I said, and now I finally know everything is not what I thought. I said, maybe I can rebuild again. I said, not from revenge but understanding. I said, I do not know if I am ready. I said, but I am no longer blind. I said, Grandma, I will try. I said, for the first time, I mean it. I said, I stood there a little longer. I said, the wind felt different now. I said, like it was carrying less weight. I said, I thought about everything I lost. I said, and everything I found in truth. I said, maybe pain was never punishment but lesson. I said, I never understood that before. I said, I always thought I was victim. I said, but maybe I was just unaware. I said, I looked at the sky above her grave. I said, I will not carry hatred the same way anymore. I said, not because I forgive everything but because I choose myself now. I said, I turned away slowly. I said, and I finally felt like I was breathing again. I said, this is enough. I said, the business event felt overwhelming as I walked into the hall. Sophia said, stay calm, they are watching everything. Daniel Brooks said, just breathe. I said, I am not the same person anymore. Sophia said, that is why they cannot ignore you now. I said, I can feel their eyes everywhere. Daniel Brooks said, let them look. I said, this is where everything changes. Reporters approached asking about my company's success. I said, we built it from nothing. Sophia said, he means hard work and persistence. Daniel Brooks said, no shortcuts. I saw relatives who once mocked me now smiling nervously. One said, Daniel, we always believed in you. I said, no, you didn't. Daniel Brooks said, honesty suits him better. My parents arrived with Ethan beside them. Silence followed immediately. Sophia said, this is going to be intense. I said, I know. Daniel Brooks said, just stay steady. The host announced my name and company success. People clapped loudly. I said, I never expected this moment. Sophia said, you earned it. Daniel Brooks said, every sleepless night counted. My father stepped forward slowly saying, Daniel, I was wrong. I said, you said I would never become anything important. He said, I failed you as a father. Silence filled the room. My mother cried saying, I didn't protect you. I said, I didn't need protection, I needed belief. Daniel Brooks said, this is truth finally speaking. Ethan stepped forward quietly saying, I spent my whole life competing against you. I said, why? He said because I feared being ordinary. Sophia said that is heavy truth. Daniel Brooks said but still not excuse. I said I don't see you as enemy anymore, Ethan. He said what does that mean? I said it means I am finally free. Sophia said that is peace. Daniel Brooks said real peace. I looked around the room and said I used to feel small here, now I feel calm. Sophia said that is growth. Daniel Brooks said that is victory. I said success gave me power but peace gave me freedom. I will never forget this moment. Reporters kept shouting questions. I said no more answers today. Sophia said good choice. Daniel Brooks said protect your peace. I walked toward exit slowly, feeling everyone watching. Sophia said they are not your audience anymore. I said I know. Daniel Brooks said then act like it. I said I finally understand everything. Sophia said what changed? I said I changed. Daniel Brooks said that is enough. I said I don't need approval anymore. Sophia said that is freedom. Daniel Brooks said in power. I looked one last time at my family and said this is closure. Sophia said finally. Daniel Brooks said finally. I said I will keep building my life without looking back ever again. Sophia said that's your new truth. Daniel Brooks said and we move forward together. I said this is who I am now, no longer the shadow of anyone ever again, period. I said I finally made my decision about Ethan today. Sophia said you sound certain. I said I am certain but not angry anymore. Daniel Brooks said that's new. I said I will help him rebuild but only under strict conditions. Sophia said that is fair. I said he must change completely or I walk away. Daniel Brooks said boundaries matter. I said Lily tried to contact me again today. Sophia said what did you do? I said I rejected her calmly. Daniel Brooks said finally closure. I said she never loved me, she loved comfort. Sophia said truth hurts but freeze. I said I understand now. I said I met Sophia later that evening. Daniel Brooks said you two getting close. I said she understands me more than anyone. Sophia said because I listen not judge. I said that is rare. Daniel Brooks said she sees who you are becoming. I said we walked through my old neighborhood today. Sophia said how did it feel? I said smaller than I remembered. Daniel Brooks said or maybe you got bigger. I said I did not recognize the boy I used to be. Sophia said do you miss him? I said no. I said I used to beg for love here. Daniel Brooks said and now I said now I build my own. Sophia said that is transformation. I said I told Ethan my conditions today. Daniel Brooks said did he agree? I said he had no choice. Sophia said you are not cruel, just clear. I said I refuse to lose myself again. Sophia said are you okay? I said yes, for the first time I feel safe. Daniel Brooks said that's new. I said safe within myself. I said I realized something today. Sophia said what? I said revenge never made me powerful. Daniel Brooks said it only kept you tied. I said yes, now I am free. Sophia said and Lily? I said I closed that door gently. Daniel Brooks said no anger. I said no emotion, just clarity. I said Sophia I think I trust you more than anyone now. Sophia said that is mutual. I said that scares me. Daniel Brooks said trust always does. I said I don't want hate anymore. Sophia said then don't keep it. I said I am letting it go slowly. Daniel Brooks said you are changing. I said I already changed, I just finally see it. Sophia said what is next? I said I build without looking back. Daniel Brooks said simple. I said not easy but necessary. I said I walked past my old house today. Sophia said and I said nothing inside me broke. Daniel Brooks said that is healing. I said I am not that boy anymore. Sophia said good. I said he was always waiting for permission. Daniel Brooks said and you stopped waiting. I said I choose myself now. Sophia said that is everything. I said then I am complete. Daniel Brooks said not complete, evolving. I said I will protect this peace. Sophia said as you should. I said I finally understand life. Daniel Brooks said tell me. I said it is not about winning, it is about becoming free. Sophia said and you are free? I said yes, I am not who I used to be anymore. Daniel Brooks said better. I said I agree and I will keep going. Sophia said that is your real story. I said I don't need their approval anymore. Daniel Brooks said finally. I said finally. Sophia said and forever? I said yes, forever. I choose forward, not back. Daniel Brooks said that's who you are now. I said I am free at last. I said this is my life now. Sophia said and you own it? I said completely. Daniel Brooks said no one else does. I said never again. I said Ethan has changed slowly over the months working under me. Sophia said people grow when life forces them to. Daniel Brooks said humility usually comes after collapse. I said he no longer speaks like someone above me. Ethan said I never understood how hard you worked until now. I said then understand it fully before expecting anything from me. He said I am trying to rebuild myself. I said then start by listening more than speaking. Sophia said that is fair structure. Daniel Brooks said he finally looks like someone learning instead of competing. I said that is all I ever wanted from him, not rivalry but respect. My parents called again asking if we can meet. My mother said we want to fix things. I said you cannot fix what you ignored for years. My father said we made mistakes. I said mistakes do not erase memories. Sophia said you do not owe them quick forgiveness. Daniel Brooks said healing is not obligation. I agreed to meet them once in a quiet place. My mother said I see you differently now. I said I am still the same person, just no longer asking to be seen. My father said we are proud of you now. I said I did not need pride, I needed presence. Silence followed after that. Ethan said softly, I understand if you never fully trust me. I said trust is earned in silence, not speeches. He nodded and said I will prove it slowly. I said then start with consistency. Sophia said that is maturity. Daniel Brooks said boundaries built you into this version of yourself. Later Sophia and I walked through the city at night. She said I admired your strength long before success found you. I said you never told me that before. She said you were too busy surviving to hear it. I said I wish I met you earlier in life. She smiled and said I was always there, just not close enough. I said what are we now? She said we are something honest. Daniel Brooks said that sounds dangerous. I said or real. She said or both. I laughed for the first time without tension. I said I feel safe when I talk to you. She said because I never needed you to be perfect. I held Grandma Eleanor's watch later alone in my room. I said you saw all of this before I did. I whispered I wish I listened to you more when you were here. The watch felt heavier than before but calmer too. I said I was never just their disappointment, I was your hope too. I remembered the boy I used to be waiting for approval at every table. I said he survived longer than he should have. Daniel Brooks said survival is not small, it is foundation. I said I used to think survival was failure. Sophia said it was preparation. I looked at my reflection and said I do not feel anger controlling me anymore. I said I feel distance from who I used to be. Ethan said from outside the room I am not asking for forgiveness yet, just time. I said time is the only honest request you have made. My mother said softly, can we still be part of your life? I said you already are, but from a distance you created. My father said we are sorry. I said I know, but knowing is not the same as forgetting. Sophia said you are not becoming cold, you are becoming clear. I said clarity feels like silence after chaos. Daniel Brooks said that is peace forming. I said I finally understand that peace is not escape, it is control over what you allow inside you. Ethan said I am trying to become someone you do not have to avoid. I said then become that person for yourself first. He said I will. I said good, then we can talk later about everything else. I stood alone for a moment after everyone left. I said I do not feel pulled by anger anymore. Sophia said what do you feel? I said direction. Daniel Brooks said that is stronger than emotion. I walked outside thinking about everything I lost and everything I kept. I said I am no longer building my life to prove them wrong. I said I am building it because I finally understand myself. Sophia said that is the real victory. I tightened my grip on the watch and said Grandma, I made it through everything you worried about. I said I am not broken by them anymore. I said I am shaped by it instead. Daniel Brooks said where do you go from here? I said forward without hesitation. Sophia said no fear. I said not anymore. Ethan said one last time, I hope one day we can be family again properly. I said maybe, but not the old version of it. I said something rebuilt and honest. My parents watched silently as I turned away. My mother said softly, we love you. I said I know, but love without understanding is not enough anymore. I walked with Sophia beside me and Daniel Brooks behind us. Sophia said you are different now. I said I am finally myself. Daniel Brooks said the past does not follow you anymore. I said no, it only explains me now. I said I used to think becoming rich was the goal. I said now I understand becoming free was the real victory. Sophia said, and are you free? I said yes, not from them but from needing them. I took one last look at everything behind me and said I am not returning to who I was. I said I am moving forward without hate, without fear, without needing approval ever again.